The first presentation, I'm going to be giving a talk here, and as you can see, it is on physician wellness and burnout, and I do enjoy the irony of having a wellness talk at 8 o'clock in the morning when we could be all enjoying another hour of sleep, so I understand that. So the learning objectives here, let's see if I can advance this. I won't read them to you. I mean, they are in the slides that were presented. So as I started preparing for something like this, and as some of you have seen maybe some talks about wellness and resilience and things, I've learned it's always important to put up a slide like this, especially as I've also went to talks especially about suicide and physician suicide to make resources available. And this is a resource that is in your slides. And if you know of friends and colleagues who could be going through a tough time, I've had some of my friends and colleagues take advantage of this resource over the pandemic, and it is a great resource for them. So I make that available to you. So I am one of you. I'm a family physician. And my practice is about 20 miles south of Youngstown in a town called Salem, Ohio, population 11,774. And we're 20 miles from the Pennsylvania border. We are that east in Ohio. And it's been 20 years since I finished residency, and I'm working at the same place. I have no idea how that happened, but very lucky to be in my first job right out of residency and still there. We are a proud independent office. We're not owned by anybody. We hope we can still remain independent with all these big gargantuan hospital systems around us. But we love what we do, and I'm still doing what I went to medical school for, so I'm very proud about that. We still see patients in the hospital and in the nursing home, and that'll be more relevant as I share more of my story with you. So as I said previously, I just completed my term as president of the Ohio Academy of Family Physicians. This photo was taken in August of 2020. And not only am I saying hello here, I'm being sworn in as the OEFP president on Zoom. Like other organizations and groups, in-person meetings converted to virtual meetings, and I did not have the luxury of having an in-person board meeting for my entire year. So things are very different in 2020. I really miss even gatherings like this, talking with family docs, catching up with old friends, making new friends. So hopefully this will be something as we share in the future. So this is my dad. And this is what the first part of this talk will be about. He practiced in the Youngstown, Ohio area for over 30 years as a solo ENT surgeon. I could talk for days about him, but I know I only have an hour. So why am I doing this talk? Something I've learned, after my father passed last year, was that everybody's grieving is different. And I've dealt with mine by sharing it out, by being transparent. And for those of you who know me, I do some things on social media, and I've been trying to share my story just so people can just kind of see what I'm going through and to share that with everybody. OEFP reached out to me to share my story just because of all the things that I was sharing out there. And they thought it'd be valuable for me to share my story as a son and as a physician who has lost a loved one. Maybe some of you can relate to some of this story. Also to share my story as a family physician taking care of COVID patients in the hospital. And for those of you who do that, will be able to relate to that as well. But maybe there's one thing that I can share with you that you can take home today to maybe help yourself or help a colleague, because physicians are awful patients. as we all know. And one of the things I've learned in my journey is we really need to take the advice that we give our patients. So just a few slides of introduction. I don't know if people can see that. It's kind of washed out a little bit. This is my dad. This photo was taken in the late 1960s when my dad was around age 25. He arrived in Youngstown, Ohio for a surgical residency after completing medical school in the Philippines. So, what a nice looking guy there, don't you think? That was the hospital I was born at, Youngstown Hospital. And back at that time, there was a robust Filipino community in the Youngstown, Ohio area. And that's where we met my future mom. And this is a picture of their honeymoon in 1971 at Miami Beach. So, found that picture there. So, and I was born a year later. Now, my dad retired from his practice in 2011. And then following that, my parents enjoyed traveling the world. They were fortunately pretty healthy a lot during that, and they were able to kind of find their way around, and they traveled with some of their Filipino friends as well, and they went to Europe, they went to South America, they went to Asia. And you'll see on the right side of this slide, my dad, I don't know if it's stereotypical Asian, but really enjoyed the karaoke. And we got to share that a lot with him, especially during holidays and things. And he also liked hats for some reason. Not sure why he was wearing a hat there, but he enjoyed it. So as we begin my story and my dad's story, this begins in January 2020. So in addition to the complexities of my father's illness, it's always in the backdrop COVID-19. So as I'm sharing the timeline of my story, I ask you to think about where you were and what you were doing during this time. So my dad's story begins in January 2020 when my parents flew to the Philippines by themselves. I was unable to go, I was working. They went for a family wedding. They were in the Philippines for 3 weeks, including parts of January and February. Here in the United States, COVID-19 was still a news story over there in Asia, as you remember. As I was watching the news very carefully in the Philippines, I was very concerned that my parents may not be able to get back because they may close down flights, they may close down countries, they may not be able to return, and I was very worried about that. Whoops. But they did return, and safely. The one thing that I remember my dad saying is he thought it was kind of unusual that especially everybody flying back from Asia had masks on the plane, which we know now is pretty commonplace. So that's something I remember that he said. So for me, March 2020 was pivotal both personally and professionally. At the beginning of March 2020, I took a trip with my wife and our nieces and nephews. You'll see them on the upper left up there. We went to Walt Disney World in Florida. It was a trip that was planned for a year, so there was no way that we were going to cancel. So while we were there, as you remember, there were talks of California starting to shut things down, and was that going to spread nationwide? And were we going to be trapped in Florida because our flights or travel or something like that would be canceled? You'll see on the lower right there, you see the very last CME event that OEFP had. It was a year and a half ago in Canton. And I gave a talk there. And this is the first CME event since then. And then you'll see on the right there, in March of 2020, I remember that was my first patient that I took up with COVID at Salem Hospital, at our regional hospital. We have about maybe 50 beds. And I wrote about this experience, and those of you who do, see COVID patients, you always remember your first patient that you've seen with that, and the emotions that you were feeling and all that. And that's when that happened to me. So in the midst of all that, my dad calls me on April 1st. I'll never forget it. He called via FaceTime, video call. I remember that because I just taught him how to do that. And he was worried he was having a stroke. Now, he's a physician. He's a bad patient. Did not want to call an ambulance. He wanted me to drop everything I was doing, drive the 30 minutes, and take him to the hospital, which I did. So that was the COVID at that time. So I took him to the ER, and the security guard said, "Yes, we'll take your dad, and you can't come in." I even pulled the doctor card. He said, "Nope." So went home with my mom, waited for the phone call, and he was admitted overnight. Fortunately, he did not have a stroke, so we were all happy about that. So over the next few weeks, he was having, symptoms of, hearing difficulties and speech and all that, which were really bad on that hospital admission, but then it got better, and then over the next few weeks, he was starting having some random symptoms. Looking back, I started to notice some subtle signs of things like forgetfulness and occasional confusion and some difficulties with vision. I kept asking myself, did he really have a stroke or not? And I'm thinking, as a doc and as a son, I'm like, did I miss something? Did they miss something? So all that stuff was going through my head. So in July and August, I started becoming more concerned because, he was having more difficulty finding things to say. And he himself started noticing this too, which I thought was kind of interesting. So I spent the next few weeks trying to get in touch with his family doc, and then his neurologist. But as we all know, back at that time, appointments were limited because of COVID. So very difficult to try to get communication. And those of you who have dealt with our broken healthcare system from the other side, as either a patient or a family member, it's hard to get communication. I had to beg staff to say, "Hey, I need you to see my dad. There is something that is just not right here. He needs another scan, he needs another MRI, he needs a doctor's visit." So Friday, September 11, 2020, Dad has his follow-up MRI. 3 days later on Monday, I was in the office seeing patients, and his neurologist calls me. And he said, "Yeah, I have the report," and his voice got really low. He says, I think it's GBM. And I'm thinking in my head, I'm not a neurologist, I'm a family doc, like, what is that? He said, glioblastoma. I was like, oh. And then you just have that realization in your head that this is just not going to be good. So at that time, I was like, hey, we have to act on this. We have to try to get him somewhere. We have to try to get him to like Cleveland Clinic or somewhere up there to try to figure out what was going on. And it was hard. It's hard usually. It was very hard with COVID. So again, our broken healthcare system was very, very frustrating. So again, with COVID-19 coloring the story, it was very difficult to get any kind of appointment, but Dad finally got his appointment for his brain biopsy, which confirmed the diagnosis, brain cancer, glioblastoma. So, had a very difficult decision to make. The family had to, either a grueling treatment course, radiation back and forth to Cleveland Clinic, which is from our place an hour and a half every day, or to let nature take its course. So one of the most challenging conversations I've had in my life is to talk about hospice with my own family. So due to COVID-19 restrictions, I was the only one able to go to Cleveland Clinic with my dad for all those appointments to ask questions. And then I was the one that had to relay this to my own family. So instead of all the frustration and the questions and the emotions directed at Cleveland Clinic doctors, they were directed at me. So I had to absorb all that emotion, all that frustration, and feel that as well as a son and as a family doctor. So after a long conversation, the family finally came together and said, hey, we're just going to keep him at home with hospice. We did not want him to pass away in a hospital by himself because of COVID restrictions, that nobody could be there. So this is a picture of us after we made that decision. He always had a smile on his face. He always remained hopeful. And those last few weeks were time that I will always treasure with my dad. And it would be something that I'll never forget. The hardest thing I've ever had to do as a family physician and as a son is to be there at the end and to pronounce my own father as passed away, 3:15 a.m. And I talked about this in an essay that I wrote later, but my first instinct was as a family physician. Where was my stethoscope? I had to confirm to myself as a son and as a doctor that he was gone. There's no more heartbeat or anything like that. And then I had the task of waking up my family at that hour and to let them know that he passed. And, something that we'll never forget.